In this video, I create a craft that's best suited for a world without any land. And for that, we need something that floats and for somewhere for people to live. Now I'm using these shipping containers that I printed in my 3D printer. Now I have modified the original files that I downloaded from Thingiverse. I added some doors and some windows just to make them a bit more livable. Now this build is going to have very little construction, but a lot of printing and a lot of painting. So that's going to be a lot of fun. Now I've printed up a whole truckload of accessories that'll make living on a barge a lot more comfortable. I've printed everything from couches and beds to pots and pans and even frying pans, so check that out a little bit later. This diorama I'm building in 1/48 scale, so to get the very fine work that I needed, I'm using my Elegoo Mars 4 Ultra. Now this thing isn't a big printer, it's only a small screen, it only has a 70-inch mono screen, but it's 9K, which means you get some really fine detail in your prints. I have 4 different 3D printers, but the Elegoo Mars 4 Ultra has become my go-to printer when I need fine detail. In Australia, we're days away from hitting winter, so I need to do some modifications to the printer. I made this heater that fits on the side, and what it does, it regulates the temperature to keep the resin thin. For cleaning and curing my resin prints, I use this bundle available from Elegoo. It's called the Mercury X, and it has both units there in the box. Now one of the things that I was always a bit skeptical was the fact there was 2 machines when I was very used to using the Anycubic machine, which was 1 unit. But one of the things that used to drive me crazy was having to swap over the washing tub to the curing plate. This, having 2 machines, I just go from one machine to another, makes it really handy. The only drawback is it's a bigger footprint because you have 2 machines, of course. Both units have a push button system, which makes it really easy to use. Now, once I remove the print from the cleaning machine, I then add some hot boiling water out of a tap to a tub, and I place the plate with the resin print still on there into the tub for about 20 seconds, enough to soften up the resin, and then using a scraper it just pops right off, so much easier. And plus the supports pop off really easily as well because they're a little bit softer. I then dry off those resin prints and that goes into the curing machine. Elegoo have a really interesting system with their UV lights. They have 2 vertical bars plus 1 below the actual turntable. This system works really well unless you're doing a small print where it's only a minute or 30 seconds curing time. The turntable does a full rotation in 1.5 minutes. So if you're doing short cures, like I said, minute, 30 seconds, it doesn't do a full rotation. To solve that problem, I created this mirror disc, and that just fits straight underneath the turntable and gives great dispersion of the UV light throughout the chamber. Good news is, if you want to replace or rather add to your curing machine, it's available from my Etsy store, and if you have any cubic wash and cure machines, I also have replacement mirrors there. The shipping containers did need a bit of a clean up because I printed them straight onto the plate, so they created what's called an elephant's foot at the bottom, so a bit of filing down. And I use this vac mat that I also printed on my other 3D printer, my filament printer, and I use that to suck up all the very fine resin dust, which is pretty gross. Just using a basic grey for the inside and a nice even coat. I then put that aside, left to dry, and I used some of this dark blue from Vallejo to paint the containers. And boy, there was a lot of containers. Plastic containers, oil barrels, and I decided I wanted to make my oil drums a bit more interesting. So I'm using some of this white and giving it a 2-tone. I first give it a nice even coat. Now I'm going for a white grey because white would be too harsh of a colour. Masked up the centerpiece with some of this Tamiya masking tape. And then back to Vallejo, this time some of their Model Air. This is just red. Then painted the rest of those oil drums with that red, as aforementioned. Couple coats to get a nice even finish on there. Then some of the other containers ended up with some of this olive green. Well, maybe they hold olive oil, who knows. And I end up some very sharp, crisp lines there. And they look really good, actually. Very happy with that. I've never done that before. It's always been a basic single colour. Now to weather them up a bit, a combination of some of that wash there, a quick spritz of water just to make that wash flow a lot easier, and so it doesn't pool up in one little spot and leaving those, those water spots. I think I printed up over, I don't know, I think over 20 barrels. Combination of these steel ones and, like I said, the plastic ones. Just for a bit of variety, just to make it visually interesting rather than just having the one type. Just to speed up things, I came up with this idea of using a piece of balsa wood with some double-sided tape on there, and I just stuck on all the barrels and hit them with a lot of wash. The same thing with these white goods. So you can see I've got fridges there, basins, even a toilet, and on the left some white water barrels. Now some of those got some light green, and those I actually mean jerry cans. There were so many accessories that I had to print. I didn't think it was ever going to end at one stage. Chocolate brown for some of the wood furniture. I've got some workbenches and desktops. And some brown sand, and I'm going to use that for the cardboard boxes. They're just for storage that'll go into some of the shelvings that I have. And seems like every post-apocalyptic diorama I do has got one of those office chairs in there. Here I have some light green dry brushing paint from Ammo and a light brush of the jerry cans here. Now I normally use these makeup brushes that my partner gives me when she's worn them out. They work well, but they're very soft and I can't seem to get the control that I want out of them. And when I go to wash them, I can't seem to get the paint completely out of those bristles. Some of this gunmetal from Ammo as well, and just using that for the storage shelves. Now I did paint some crates the same colour as the brown that I used for the furniture earlier, but I'm going to use some of this orange brown as a very light dusting of colour over it. Just to add a bit of visual interest and break it up a bit. Now I didn't have any light blue dry brushing paint, so I have to go the old school way and create my own. Now I'm just using the really thick stuff that's at the bottom of the Tamiya paints. I'm using that with a combination of the white as well. Mix it up, get a really light coat, and then dry brush that onto my barrels. This is what I used to always do before they created that dry brushing paint, which is just thick paint. Talking about thick paint, here's some more dry brushing paint from Ammo. It's the dark sand, very light coat again, and this really brings out a whole bunch of detail. Now I'm combining these two paints, the light grey and the white grey, to create a wash for all the bits that I painted white. Like I mentioned earlier, the fridge, the toilet, and some water containers there as well. And this just goes into the crevices and really brings out the details. Now I will dry brush them with white a little bit later. There's my stove / oven. I wanted to add some safety type decals to my cylinders that I'd created earlier. So I just rummaged through my pile of decals that I had, and I just found things that were kind of appropriate. At the end of the day, they did look convincing, so I was happy with the results there. Now detailing the top of the stove, just painting in the hot plates with some dark grey. And I did warn you, I did make up some pots and pans and cups and saucers. These things are tiny, so imagine the size of them in 1/48 scale. Well, you don't have to imagine, you can see it. To make everything look like it's been lived in, I did have to print up so many accessories and just have them laying around the place. Like those little water bottles I'd mentioned earlier, just putting them on the shelves. There's some more glass bottles as well. And potatoes. I printed anything I could find. And in 1/48 scale, so they're tiny. They're those cardboard boxes that I painted up earlier. You can see it's looking like something. It looks real. For the interior of the containers, I just gave it a nice light wash. Some of this dark brown. It needs to look slightly weathered on the inside as well. And some of that light grey wash that I used earlier on the white appliances. Couple generators that I printed up again. Also got the treatment of that white wash. I have no idea where they're going to get the fuel for it. That's a different story altogether. So do not leave any comments about that. They do need to sleep somewhere, so a couple beds and couches. And basically, I mean, in a post-apocalyptic world, they will be out, Now, trying to forage for anything they could find to make their lives a lot easier to live. Now, look at that table very carefully. You can see some of the cups and saucers that I've stuck. And I stuck them on with some super glue. And just working out the placement of where all the furniture is going into the kitchen area. And there's a little fire extinguisher because safety is very important. Because everything was printed in resin, there's really only two types of adhesives you can use. It's either Araldite, the 5-minute 2-part epoxy glue, or super glue. This is a storage shelf that I made out of some plastic card. That's just going to go up against the wall. Then I added a whole bunch of canned food onto that shelf. And if you haven't already, please smash that like button, subscribe to the channel. Your support's always appreciated, and don't forget that notification bell. For the deck, I used 1.5mm basswood, and I just created that with my laser cut engraver. And for the frame, I'm using some 10mm balsa wood. Now, to hold it all together, bit of super glue, very easy to do, and it sticks instantly. One, because it is super glue, and two, it's going onto wood. And there's our deck. Very simple. Or just a flat plate and some sides. Very quick build, especially if you're using a laser cut engraver. Now, this is the hull. Now, I originally started using this plastic card, and I assembled it all, and it was looking good. I was happy with it, but I started to get second thoughts about it, and I thought, I'm going to pour some resin, and that's going to use up a whole bunch of resin because it's not sealed. So I had to rethink what I was doing there. I even got to the point of super gluing it into place and then painting it and thinking, seriously, I need to change this idea. Just the amount of resin, like I mentioned, is going to be astronomical using it in that area there. So I ended up designing the whole hull in Blender and then 3D printing it on my filament printer. That was a lot easier, and because it's a solid, well, not solid, but it's a hull, it's not going to use as much resin when I pour around it, which is a good thing because resin is expensive. Some balsa wood spacers, and these are the 10mm ones that I was using earlier. Quite a bit of dolloping of super glue. That glued straight into place. And once that had all dried and made sure it was nice and solid, it was on to painting it. Did a first coat of German red brown from Vallejo, and then covered the whole thing with some pigment also from Vallejo, and I combined that with some sepia paint, which turned into a really thick paste, and I just dabbed it on using a piece of foam. These shipping containers will have a couple of different levels, and I need to make the platforms on top of these particular shipping containers. Once again, I created that level using 1.5mm basswood. Just like I did the main deck, everything's super glued into place. Now this time around, I'm using 5mm balsa compared to the previous one, which is 10. And I'm just working out the placement of where everything's going to go right now. And I'll have another shipping container on top of that once I get the orientation right. I think my OCD kicked in because the floorboards had to go all the right way. I originally was going to make this diorama in 1/35 scale, but when I printed up the containers, they were so big, I moved to 1/48 scale. Now, let's paint those floorboards with this light grey. Now, this is the Model S, so it's a much thinner paint, and rather than giving it an even coat, it kind of soaks into the timber and makes it look a little bit more realistic. The whole thing, again, gets a whole spritz of water, and then a very generous coat of some of this dark brown. Majority of the paints I use are from Vallejo. And then once that was dry, we head to the black. And I'm just covering it randomly. There's no niceties about it. I'm just slopping it on wherever I need it. The wash here looks really heavy, but most of it actually disappears when it dries out. Now I've gotten to the habit of really slopping it on, knowing that most of it disappears. I thought I'll add a couple bookcases in there as well. That was a bookshelf, and this is my main bookcase. Now distorting the knowledge of the lost and forgotten world. This is a bit fiddly, but well worth the effort. I painted each book individually and then put the little names on the spines there. They come up rather well. I was happy with those. And I just thought I'd do some posters on the walls of the containers as well. You know, make it a bit more homey. There's the bedroom. All done. Looks pretty good. Now, before I paint the outsides of the shipping containers, I need to seal in all the doors and windows so I don't get any overspray. I really don't want all the work I've created on the interiors to be destroyed by overspray from when I'm doing the outside. Really happy with the detail in there. It looks really good. Took a bit of time, but again, well worth the effort. Now for the first coat, because I'm going to do some of this hairspray chipping technique, the first coat needs to be a rust brown. Now that's an even coat over the whole shipping containers. And then I'm using some of this German red brown, and I'm going to do a bit of a mottled finish to it. So when we do the top coats of colour, when we chip away, we expose, you know, a bit of a variance in the rust colour. Like I said, this is the hairspray technique, and it doesn't matter what hairspray you use, it'll all work because they're all water-based. Now the hairspray, I just decanted into that small little tube just to make use of it a lot easier. Nice thick coat. The thicker you spray the hairspray, the more chipping you're going to get, and the easier it'll come off too. As soon as you put a bit of water on it, it'll just flake off. For the actual chipping, all I did was grab myself a brush, make sure it's full of water, and just brush it over that paint. Gave it a couple seconds to soak in, and using a toothpick, you can see it just flaked off. It was really easy for it to come off. The more water you put on there, the more chipping you're going to get. It's a really simple technique, and the results are really convincing. I ended up using a slightly stiffer brush, and in the end, the brush was able to chip away through the paint as well. I did prefer the results I was getting from the brush over the toothpick ones. Time to do a bit of wash to the outside. Off camera, I did seal the whole lot with some clear, and then a nice healthy coat of some wash. Once that was dry, it was time to assemble the containers to the platforms, or rather the decking, either one. Super glue. Super glue is good. Super glue is your best friend when you're working with this type of stuff. Or until you glue your fingers together, then we're not mates anymore. The super glue I use, I just buy from Bunnings, which is a hardware store available here in Australia, and they're like $3, $2, $3, and you get like a dozen of them in the packet. They last forever, and I buy, I don't know, 5 packets at a time, and they just sit in my drawer until I need them. I then very carefully align the shipping containers onto the deck. Safety is very important to this cruise, so we need some handrails to make sure they don't fall overboard into the very contaminated lake, because it's a bit gross. And believe it or not, there's actually a tower there. You can hardly see it against the black background. Now I'm using some of that pigment from Vallejo again, the rust pigment, and there it is. It looks really good. I like using this stuff. It's very convincing. Wow, look at that. Super glue. I really enjoy adding these type of details to structures. It really brings everything to life. Usually when I print things up, I make sure I fill up the build plate as much as I possibly can. I printed so much of these hand railing that I've got enough for the next couple of dioramas, as long as I make them in 1/48 scale. Rather do them in one hit than having to constantly reprint them. Time to pollute up that lake, and I've got some of these barrels that I'm just chopping in half using a grinding tool in my Dremel. Here I'm using some araldite to glue those portions of the barrel into place. If you haven't noticed, I've already poured a very thin layer of resin as my top coat, and this is purely to seal everything in. So in case I do have some leaks, you know, I'm not going to lose so much. Plus, I need a layer for my fish and my barrels to kind of sink into. Now I'm just using some clear UV resin and just gluing them into place with some UV light. This is the resin I'm using. I bought this locally from a store just up the road. Cost me an absolute fortune. This is a 2-part mixture, and the ratio is 3:1. So basically 3 parts resin and 1 part of the activator. Now in my first pour I'm doing 600 ml of the resin and 200 ml of the activator. Now I need to add a bit of color to it, so I'm using some of this ink here, and I'll probably pop in maybe 4 or 5 drops until I get a consistency of maybe like creek water, that murkiness, you know, that green murky water. Because again, it's kind of polluted, and I don't want it to be nice and sunny Mediterranean blue. It's got to look yucky. Stir right through until it's nice and even, and then pouring it straight into the base, or rather onto the base. Now I didn't have enough in the first pour, so I ended up doing another pour of exactly the same ratios. Now this stuff you can pour up to, I think it's 4 inches. Any more than that and it gives off too much heat. This stuff takes 48 hours to harden. It does have a working time of about an hour and a half before it starts getting thick. Now one of the things you will get is air bubbles, so if they pop up I just use one of these blow torches and just pop out the air bubbles. If you check out some of my older videos, specifically the mutant shark one where I did a huge resin pour, you'll see I have a lot of problems with pouring resin for some reason. Don't know why, but I suck at it. But this one actually turned out fantastic, worked really well. The box is simply to keep the dust off the resin while it's curing, and after 48 hours I was back and I had to rip off these side acrylic pieces. Surprisingly, they actually came off without breaking, so I'll be able to reuse them in a future build. I just flip them over and glue the other side, because they were actually glued with Celastic. I did need to trim the sides, because the resin kind of creeps up the sides a bit and creates a bit of a lip. Those areas will be hidden once I cover them up with the waves. Back onto some more detailing, I decided to add some ferns and some greenery onto the barge. I did some zenithal lighting to the figures. Check out my other videos, there's plenty of information on them. And I've been wanting to get some good quality brushes, and I came across this website called Golden Maple. They do a whole bunch of different types of brushes for miniature paintings. And they use a very specific hair in their brushes, and get ready for this, it's Siberian mink sable hair. Doesn't that sound fancy? And they also do these dry brushing brushes, and they look really cool, so I'm really keen to try them out, because like I said earlier, those dry brushing ones I was using that were for makeup were really soft. I'm far from an expert in figure painting, but one of the first things I noticed was how well the brush loads up with paint. It just made the flow of the paint so much nicer across the figure and gave me a lot of control. Really happy with it. You've got to be careful of how thick the paint, because of how soft the brushes are. The thicker paints tend to kind of handle a bit harder. If you're interested in these brushes, go and check out the link I'll have in the description. The area they really excelled in was when I came to blending the colours. That was a much thinner paint, because I used a bit of medium to thin out the paints that I'd used. I was really able to control the shading that I did on these garments. For the colours of the garments, I just picked out whatever looked interesting. There wasn't any rule or guideline that I went by. I just picked the colour. It looked good, I used it. I was also able to get a lot more control when it came to skin tones. I'm keen to test it on larger figures at a later date. Now let's test some of these dry brushing brushes. Now these bristles tend to be a little bit stiffer, so I'll be keen to see how well I can control the actual paint. And as you can see, I've got a lot of control actually. The brush has just enough stiffness in it for me to control how much paint actually hits the brush. And another great thing is when you wash it, all the paint actually comes out. There's no paint residue left in the brush. I'm thinking that's a win. With all the figures done, it's back onto detailing the structure once again. Earlier I printed up some of these ladders, and these are the same ladders I'd use in my radar diorama. The communication station. Check it out, it's a pretty cool one, uses shipping containers as well. Here I'm just working out the placing of all the furniture where I'm going to glue everything, just to give me a good idea before I commit myself into an asylum. I think in a diorama where you have a houseboat in the middle of a lake, you would want it cluttered with so many resources and accessories just to make it a bit more realistic, because if that was me, I'd be collecting everything I could find to throw onto that barge. You just never know when you're going to need it, or in fact ever come across. So the more jerry cans you have filled with water, fuel, or whatever it is, yes, I don't know where they're getting the fuel from, but they are. I guess these peeps are just very resourceful. Before I go any further, I think I need to create some of those waves that I mentioned earlier. This is some of that impasto gel. What this stuff is, a very thick gel, and you just brush it on so it kind of looks like waves, and then when it dries clear. Yeah, I know, it looks like bird poop at the moment, but when it dries, it looks awesome. It actually does look like waves. That's going to take about 24 hours to dry, so while that's drying, I need to make some shutter doors for those windows of the shipping containers. Just using some 5mm balsa wood for the framing, and again some super glue to hold everything into place. For the corrugated roofing, I'm using some of this tin foil that they use, to deliver warm food in when you're being catered for. I found this corrugated jig on Thingiverse, and what you need to do first is, before you can paint this stuff, you need to file it down or sandpaper it down just to roughen up so paint can stick to it. I just used a cotton earbud and I just pushed through and created corrugation. Really simple to use, and the scale looks awesome. Again, guess what? Super glue to glue it all together. But it's right about here I realised, that balsa wood's too thick, so I need to fix that up. So I pulled out my grinding tool, cut it in half so it was much thinner, and then using some sandpaper, and you have to do it in a figure 8 so it sands nice and evenly, and that made the shutters look to scale. Now I'm just making some pot plant holders, surrounds, I don't know what do you call them? Boxes, that'll do, boxes. Again, some of that 1.5mm basswood, and this is a leftover piece that I had from a previous build, and they kind of looked to scale, which was great. For the soil that's inside these crates and the bigger tub, that's some 2-part epoxy ribbon, and that hardens in about 10 to 15 minutes, so you got to work pretty quickly. I pushed all those ferns into place. Once that dried, I then gave the whole soil a bit of a wash with some of that, that dark wash that I used earlier. And that came up really nice. It looks like, some soil, which is, guess what? It's supposed to look like soil. Check out my waves. Look how good they look. Told you they come up great. This is the hatch to give people access to the lower deck where the engine room is. And that's a little radio which runs on Bluetooth that connects to the headphones. I think those ferns really added a great touch to the barge, or houseboat, whatever you want to call it. Time to weather up those shutters. Again, using the same wash that I've been using through the whole thing. A bit of spritz of water to make sure it runs really nicely and smoothly and evenly. Oh my god, super glue. Did you guess I was going to use super glue? These peeps on the houseboat were very fortunate. They were able to acquire a marine radar. And I printed that up on my Elegoo printer, the Mars 4 Ultra. I'm going to super glue that radar onto the top of that tower that I printed up early and painted. The one that disappeared against the black background. And for the wiring, I'm using some solder. This is some really cheap stuff that I bought in one of those $2 shops. This solder to use as cable is really cool because it's soft and it's pliable. To create some bracing for the cabling to keep it in place, I'm using some of this Tamiya masking tape. I stick one end down, wrap it around, and then on the finishing end, just one small drop of super glue to hold it into place. And to make the cabling a bit more interesting, a bit of red paint and some silver paint for that bracing. I think the tower adds a really nice touch to the houseboat. And this is just a bit of 3mm basswood and just painted black to decorate the sides, to cover up all those nasty foamy areas. There was so much extra detail in this diorama, it took way longer than I expected it to. But I think all that extra effort really paid off. Now let's go out and check out the final look. Do you think you could live on a houseboat in the middle of nowhere? Let me know in the comments. I don't know if even I could do that. If you want to check out my other videos, have a look at these two. I think you'll enjoy one of those two videos. In the meantime, I'll see you in the next video.